Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into, well, one of the most compelling questions out there right now. What does it really mean for artificial intelligence to think?
Yeah, it's a big one.
And are we actually getting anywhere close to, forging genuine minds out of silicon?
Yep.
Building something like artificial souls?
It's a question that, let's be honest, is often surrounded by a lot of hype. You see these incredibly capable AI demos, things that seem almost magical, right?
Absolutely.
But what happens when you look past that impressive surface, when you actually conduct rigorous empirical tests? We've got a really crucial piece of the puzzle today, and maybe from a source you wouldn't immediately expect. Researchers at Apple, they published a paper called The Illusion of Thinking.
The illusion of thinking.
Okay.
And it gives us some really concrete experimental data. It offers a potentially sobering look at whether current AI models genuinely think in the way we normally mean when we use that word.
That sounds fascinating. So take it from the philosophical clouds down to, hard data.
And our main source for this deep dive, the one that kind of ties it all together, is a paper called Forging the Silicon Soul.
Right.
And it takes those specific findings, those empirical results from Apple, and looks at them through a really unique, much broader lens.
Yeah, it uses this powerful framework the authors call the river of reality.
The river of reality.
It's essentially a systems view of reality itself. It suggests reality is structured in layers of emergent complexity, like a hierarchy built on different kinds of fundamental flows. Interesting. It gives us a different way to think about intelligence, not as just one single thing, but maybe something that has to be built up, layer by layer from the ground up.
Okay, so our mission today for this deep dive is really about connecting those dots, getting some perspective. We're going to start by unpacking these surprising, maybe challenging findings from Apple's Illusion of Thinking paper. Get the facts straight first.
Good plan.
Then we'll shift gears. We'll try to understand what those findings might really mean by looking at them through this big picture river of reality framework from Forging the Silicon Soul.
And see how they fit together.
Exactly. And finally, we'll explore what the authors of Forging the Silicon Soul argue is fundamentally missing. What's missing from today's AI, if we ever want to get to true artificial intelligence, not just, a clever imitation.
A critical question.
And why should you care about all this? Well, because this framework, this perspective, it could fundamentally change how you think about AI's current abilities. It cuts through some of the noise, maybe, and points towards the incredibly complex interdisciplinary challenges that are ahead if we're serious about building minds.
It's not just an engineering problem anymore.
Seems like it. Okay, let's really dig in. Where does this whole discussion start? With the hard data, right? Apple paper, The Illusion of Thinking. What drove them to do this research, and what kind of tests do they actually run?
Absolutely. Starting with the data is key. The motivation for the Apple researchers, it seems, came from recognizing the limits of standard AI benchmarks.
You mean like those tests we always see results for? Math problems, coding.
Exactly. Those standard tests, math, coding challenges, trivia, reading comprehension, all that stuff, they show impressive capabilities, no doubt. But there's a big problem.
Which is?
The massive data sets these models are trained on often contain examples of those exact problems, or very, very similar ones. Sometimes even the answers themselves might be lurking in the training data.
Contamination.
Right. So if the AI has basically seen the test question or something very close to it before, well, it becomes incredibly difficult to tell if it's truly reasoning its way to a new solution or if it's just doing incredibly sophisticated pattern matching, pulling something relevant from its memory, essentially.
So it looks like thinking, but it might just be recall.
It might just be regurgitation or sort of interpolating between things it already knows really well, finding the closest match in its vast experience.
Okay, so they wanted to design a test where the AI couldn't just rely on having seen the answer or something like it, something genuinely new.
Precisely. They needed an environment where they could control the inputs really tightly, where they could know for sure if the AI was generating a solution based on general principles, on logical steps, or if it was just guessing or pattern matching from training data.
So what did they use?
They turned to controlled puzzle environments. Think classic logic puzzles.
Exactly.
Things like the Tower of Hanoi, moving discs between pegs following specific rules.
Yes, I remember that one.
Or checker jumping, moving checkers on a board with constraints. River crossing puzzles, getting items across a river. You can only take certain things together.
Right, those brain teasers.
And Blocks World, which is about manipulating stacks of blocks, planning sequences of moves, these kinds of things.
Okay, so problems where you can really break them down into clear steps and rules.
Exactly. And here's the crucial part. These environments allowed the researchers to precisely manipulate the complexity of the problem.
How so?
Well, take the Tower of Hanoi. You can just add more discs. Simple change, but it exponentially increases the number of steps needed, the depth of the planning required.
Ah, I see.
With checker jumping, you could use a bigger board or more checkers. It's not just making the numbers bigger randomly, it's systematically increasing the logical complexity, the number of steps, the sort of branching factor of possible moves you have to consider.
So it really tests the planning and the logic, not just finding one answer.
Exactly. It's about evaluating the step-by-step process, especially when that process demands more intricate planning, more novel combinations of the basic rules.
Got it.
Yeah.
So testing the ability to handle new structures, compose solutions, not just recall patterns. And what kind of AI models do they actually test with these puzzles?
They focus specifically on what they called large reasoning models, or LRMs.
LRMs, right?
These are models that are specifically designed or maybe fine-tuned after initial training explicitly for reasoning tasks.
Right.
And a key feature of many of these LRMs is that they generate an explicit thinking process.
Like the chain of thought stuff we hear about.
Exactly, a chain of thought. Before they give their final answer, they output this text that supposedly represents their step-by-step reasoning.
And the idea there is that showing the work helps them get it right.
That's the theory. By externalizing these steps, the model can supposedly work through the logic more effectively, keep track of things, and arrive at better answers, especially for problems that need multiple steps.
Okay, so they took these models, built to simulate thinking, built to show their work, and they threw these increasingly complex puzzles at them. What happened? What were the really key findings from the illusion of thinking?
Okay, this is where the paper's title really starts to make sense, and it's probably the most striking finding. When the problems reached a certain level of complexity.
Which they could precisely control.
Right, which they carefully define as high complexity within these specific puzzle contexts. The accuracy of these LRMs didn't just, gradually get worse. You might expect that, right? They get less efficient, make a few more mistakes as it gets harder.
Sure, that seems logical.
But that's not what happened. Instead, their performance completely collapsed.
Collapsed. Like how?
Like accuracy plummeting, often straight down to zero.
Yeah.
Once they crossed a specific threshold of complexity.
Zero accuracy. Wow.
Mhm.
That's not a gentle slope downwards. That sounds like a cliff.
It really is. The paper calls it hitting a hard ceiling.
Yeah.
It's not just quantitatively worse, it's a qualitative shift in behavior.
Yeah.
Below that point, they might do pretty well, maybe even generate reasoning steps that look plausible. But once the complexity gets too high, their ability to actually find the correct solution just vanishes, almost entirely.
And this happened even though they have these fancy chain of thought mechanisms.
Yes. And this is critical. It happened despite having those mechanisms running and despite having plenty of token budget.
Token budget, what's that?
It's basically the computational allowance the AI has to generate text. It includes the thinking steps and the final answer. They had enough budget to generate really long, complex reasoning chains if they needed to.
But they still failed.
They still failed. They had the capacity on paper to generate the necessary logical steps, but they simply couldn't navigate the problem space successfully once it got truly complex.
Wow. Hitting a hard ceiling, zero accuracy. That is stark. It really suggests that the thinking process they generate isn't actually enabling them to push through that kind of deep complexity.
That's definitely the implication. And the paper highlights this even more by describing 3 performance regimes they saw. They compared these LRMs, the reasoning models, to standard large language models, LLMs, the ones that don't typically use that explicit chain of thought.
Okay, how do they compare?
Well, at low complexity, for the really simple versions of the puzzles. Surprisingly, the standard LLMs often did better than the LRMs.
Better. Why?
They were just more efficient. They didn't waste time in computation generating thinking steps that weren't needed for easy problems. They just gave the answer.
Yeah, I'm talking.
Then, at medium complexity, this is where the LRMs really showed their advantage. The chain of thought seemed genuinely helpful here. They outperformed the standard LLMs. It looked like the thinking was actually working for problems that needed a moderate sequence of logical steps.
Okay, so the reasoning helps in the middle ground.
But, and this is the crucial part at high complexity, the regime where things got really tough, both types of models collapsed.
Both.
Both. The enhanced reasoning mechanisms of the LRMs, the chain of thought that helped them in the medium zone, well, it just wasn't enough. It didn't prevent total failure when the problems demanded deeper, more intricate, more compositional logic.
So the fancy thinking process helps you climb partway up the hill, maybe, but it doesn't actually get you over the mountaintop.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. And then there's another finding that it's just really counterintuitive, especially if you assume the AI is genuinely trying to think harder.
What's that?
It's what they called the counterintuitive scaling of reasoning effort. As the problems got more complex, as they got closer to that point of collapse, the actual computational thinking effort the LRM put into the problem, measured by the number of tokens in its chain of thought, it often decreased.
Wait, it decreased as the problem got harder.
Yes. Even though they had the token budget, the capacity to generate longer, more detailed thinking steps, the models tended to produce shorter or less comprehensive, or sometimes just repetitive reasoning steps right before or right at the point where they failed.
That is weird. That feels like the exact opposite of what a person would do. You'd expect more effort, deeper thought, right?
You would. It's almost as if the process itself became less expansive, less exploratory, just as the challenge ramped up.
Not more so.
Why? Why would that happen? What do the authors suggest?
Well, the implication, fitting with this whole illusion idea, is that the chain of thought isn't reflecting a robust internal reasoning engine that digs deeper when needed.
It's perhaps more like generating text that looks like plausible reasoning based on patterns it's learned. So, when the underlying pattern matching ability hits its limit on a truly novel, complex problem structure it hasn't effectively seen before, the model doesn't have a deeper gear to shift into.
And it stalls.
It might just struggle to generate the next plausible token in that thinking sequence, which could lead to these shorter chains or getting stuck in repetitive loops that don't actually explore the solution space effectively. It's mimicking the form of thinking, you see, but maybe lacks the underlying logical substance needed to maintain coherence and effort when things get really tough.
Okay, that makes a disturbing kind of sense. Mimicking the form, but not the function under pressure.
And maybe the most damning piece of evidence, the one that really speaks to the nature of this thinking, relates to their failure to use explicit algorithms.
What did they do there?
In some of the experiments, they didn't just give the AI the puzzle, they also explicitly provided it with the correct step-by-step algorithm to solve it.
Like handing a student the exact formula.
Exactly. For instance, giving the LRM the standard recursive algorithm for solving the Tower of Hanoi puzzle.
Okay, so you'd expect, if it understands procedures, performance should skyrocket, right? Especially on the complex versions where it failed before.
That's the logical expectation. If these models could truly understand and follow procedural instructions, giving them the optimal algorithm should be a massive boost. They don't need to discover the method anymore, just execute it. It should let them leapfrog the complexity barrier.
Yeah, they just did it.
The results were, while striking, the LRMs showed no significant improvement in their ability to solve the puzzles, even when they were explicitly handed the correct algorithm.
No significant improvement, even with the instructions.
Pretty much, yeah. This is a really critical piece of data. It suggests a fundamental deficit, not just in discovering complex logical procedures through some internal thought process, but even in reliably executing known, clearly defined procedures when faced with that kind of compositional novelty and high complexity. Their performance didn't really change qualitatively just because they were given the blueprint for the solution.
So let's put all that together then.
Yeah.
You've got the complete accuracy collapse at high complexity. You've got the weird decrease in thinking effort just when it's needed most. And now, this inability to even properly use a correct algorithm when it's handed to them. It really does paint a picture, doesn't it? Where the thinking isn't flexible, genuine reasoning that can handle novelty and deep logic. It sounds much more like incredibly sophisticated pattern matching and text generation that just hits a fundamental wall when it faces true compositional complexity. It hasn't effectively memorized or approximated from its training data.
That is precisely the conclusion the Apple researchers lean towards in The Illusion of Thinking. It provides pretty strong empirical backing for the idea that just making models bigger or adding these current types of chain of thought layers onto the existing neural architectures It just isn't enough. It's not going to get us to general intelligence that can handle robust logic and complex, novel composition.
So it points to a fundamental architectural limitation, maybe, not just a matter of scale.
That seems to be the core message from their experiments, yeah.
Okay, that's a really powerful data-driven challenge to the sort of common narrative about AI just inevitably scaling up to superintelligence. Now, Forging the Silicon Soul, our primary source here, takes these specific findings and tries to make sense of them using a much grander framework, right? This river of reality.
Exactly.
What is this framework? And you mentioned it's rooted in systems thinking. What does that mean in this context?
Right. So systems thinking, just broadly speaking, is a way of looking at the world. Instead of just breaking things down into their smallest parts and analyzing them in isolation.
Like traditional reductionist science often does.
Kind of, yeah. Systems thinking focuses on how those parts interact, how they connect, how patterns and behaviors emerge at different levels of organization. It looks for feedback loops, hierarchies, and often tries to find fundamental principles or dynamics like flow that might apply across lots of different domains, from biology to economics to, well, maybe even reality itself.
So looking at the whole picture, the connections, the dynamics.
Exactly. Instead of just analyzing, say, the spark plug in a car, you look at how the whole engine system works together, how fuel flows, how it interacts with the transmission, the road, the whole interconnected system.
Okay, so the river of reality takes this systems approach and applies it to everything, to reality.
That's the ambition of the framework, yes. As it's laid out in Forging the Silicon Soul, it posits that reality isn't just a random collection of stuff. It can be understood as a hierarchy, layers of emergent complexity building one on top of the other.
Like geological strata.
That's one way to think about it. Or like a river, as the name suggests, flowing through different landscapes. Each stage of the river, each landscape has different characteristics, but it depends entirely on the stable flow coming from the stage before it.
Okay, and these stages are called tiers. And they're defined by different kinds of flows.
Precisely. The framework describes these tiers of reality, and each tier is characterized by the dominant kinds of flows that are happening within it.
That's a pretty big idea. Let's walk through these tiers. Where does this river even begin? What's the source?
Okay, so the framework starts at the absolute base, tier 1, the physical basis of flow. This is the bedrock, the foundation on which everything else is constructed.
Physics and chemistry.
Exactly. This is the realm described by physics and chemistry. Here you have the fundamental stuff, energy, material, and information in its most basic physical sense, like the state of a particle. And this stuff is governed by predictable physical laws.
Laws of thermodynamics,
Yeah.
gravity.
All of that. These laws create a stable, predictable canvas, a consistent environment where things happen reliably. And the concept of flow here is used in its most literal physical meaning. Like the flow of heat from hot to cold, the flow of electricity through a wire, the velocity and flux of particles moving according to physical forces. It's the predictable movement governed by fundamental laws.
Go like the river's current right at the source, just following gravity down the rocks. Very fundamental, very predictable.
Exactly the idea. The most basic, reliable current. Now, upon this stable physical foundation, more complex things can emerge. Which brings us to tier 2, the emergence of life.
Biology enters the picture.
Right. This is where those fundamental flows from tier 1, the energy, the material, the basic information, get captured, organized, and harnessed. Harnessed into systems that are self-regulating and self-replicating.
Living things.
Living things. And the framework actually describes a progression within this tier. It starts with the cell, the basic unit. It manages its own internal flows, taking in energy, processing materials, managing its internal information like DNA, all to maintain its own existence.
Okay, the fundamental unit of life.
Then cells organize. They form organs. These are specialized collections of cells that work together to manage a specific, crucial flow for a larger system. Think of a heart. Its job is managing the flow of blood. Lungs manage the flow of air. A kidney manages the flow of waste products.
Specialized flow managers.
Exactly. And then finally, you get the complex organism, like a human being or any complex animal. This is an integrated system of systems, all the organs working together. And at this level, you see the emergence of, well, basic biological intelligence, innate drives, instincts, and crucially, what the framework calls rudimentary consciousness.
Rudimentary consciousness.
Yeah, meaning an integrated awareness of its own state in its environment. Enough awareness to enable basic agency, seeking food, avoiding predators, finding shelter. An internal sense of self, however basic.
So each level here builds on the one below. Organs need working cells. The organism needs functioning organs. Is that dependence important?
It's absolutely core to the whole framework. Forging the Silicon Soul really hammers this point home, dependency. A weak, unstable, or unreliable flow at a lower tier fundamentally limits or even prevents the stable emergence and healthy functioning of the tiers above it.
Like you can't build a house on shaky foundations.
Precisely. You can't have complex biology without stable physics and chemistry. A heart simply can't function if the cells making it up are dying. The lower level must be stable and reliable for the higher level to exist and function properly.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. So stable physics enables life. Stable life enables. What comes next?
Well, building upon the platform provided by complex organisms, especially the human organism with its capacity for complex thought and consciousness, we get to Tier 3, the hierarchy of sociocultural flows.
Society and culture.
Right. This is where totally new kinds of flow emerge. These are more abstract flows, built on the foundation of human society, on the collective interactions of conscious individuals. And the framework argues these sociocultural flows also emerge in a specific sequence, a necessary developmental order.
Okay, another hierarchy. What's the first sociocultural flow? The foundation for society.
According to this framework, the first and most fundamental flow for any shared reality, for any complex society, is the flow of information, and its engine is science.
Science as the first flow. Why?
Because it's not just about random data points. Science is the systematic study of truth. It produces verifiable data and validated understanding about the world. It aims to create a stable, shared, objective understanding of reality.
Like establishing facts we can all agree on.
Exactly. Making sure we mostly agree on objective facts, on how the physical and biological world actually works. Water boils at 100 Celsius at sea level, gravity makes things fall, certain germs cause certain diseases. Without this reasonably stable, shared flow of information, a society couldn't coordinate even basic tasks reliably. It's the bedrock of shared knowledge.
Okay, so science gives us the shared factual grounds. What gets built on top of that foundation of information?
Building on that stable base of information comes the flow of connection, and the domain that explores this is art.
Art. How does that follow from science?
Well, think about it. Science deals with objective, often universal facts. Art, in this framework's view, studies membership. It's about how disparate elements, whether people, ideas, sounds, colors, words, can be woven together into meaningful, coherent wholes.
Bringing things together.
Yes. And when this weaving, this integration is done successfully, it creates beauty. Not just visual beauty, but the beauty of a coherent argument, a moving piece of music, a well-structured community. The output of this flow is a sense of connection, shared identity, belonging, empathy, maybe even love in a broad, unifying sense.
So it binds individuals and ideas together into something more meaningful than just a collection of facts.
Precisely. This flow allows us to form cultures, communities, find shared meaning, shared narratives. It connects us beyond just the exchange of objective information.
Okay. Information gives facts. Connection weaves them into meaning and belonging. What's next?
Next, building upon that sense of shared identity and connection comes the flow of hierarchy. This is manifested through things like religion, ethics, and shared values.
Hierarchy. Meaning.
Meaning that once you have a group with a shared identity brought together by connection, that group needs to decide what's important. What principles should guide behavior? How should resources and actions be prioritized? This flow studies value, and its output is judgment. The ability to prioritize, to deem things good or bad, right or wrong, based on a shared framework.
Establishing rules and priorities for the group.
Exactly. This creates a shared hierarchy of values and norms. And this shared understanding of what's valued is absolutely essential for building large-scale social trust. It allows people who don't know each other personally to interact and cooperate because they share underlying expectations about behavior, about fairness, about what's considered acceptable. Think about the shared values that underpin a legal system or a professional code of ethics.
Right. You trust that most people won't steal, not just because of laws, but because there's a shared value against it.
Precisely. That underlying shared value enables trust.
Okay, so shared values enable trust. And trust, especially trust at scale between strangers, enables.
Exactly where you're heading. It enables the flow of commerce, which is studied by economics.
Money and markets.
Fundamentally, yes. When you have widespread social trust built on that shared hierarchy of values and resting on a stable base of information, then you can engage in complex, reliable exchange. The study of exchange produces markets, and the dynamic within those markets, the movement of goods, services, ideas, capital, that's the flow of commerce.
This drives complexity.
Enormously. Specialization, trade, investment, innovation, all driven by this flow. It generates incredible societal complexity and dynamism, allowing interactions far beyond the local tribe or village. It's a huge engine of human progress and interaction.
Okay, but that kind of complex commerce, lots of people interacting, trading,
Ah,
that must create problems too, right? Conflicts, coordination issues.
absolutely. The very complexity and dynamism generated by the flow of commerce inevitably creates new challenges. Coordination problems, how to provide public goods, resource distribution conflicts, power imbalances, things that markets, left entirely to themselves, often can't solve effectively.
So you need something else.
You need the flow of governance, which is the domain of politics. Politics, in this framework, studies force, meaning the legitimate use of authority and power within a society to make collective decisions and enforce rules.
Governments, laws, institutions.
Exactly. The output of this flow is collective action laws, regulations, policies, building infrastructure, managing collective resources. Governance is about managing the complexity that arises from commerce and other social interactions. It tries to solve collective action problems, regulate society towards shared goals, and maintain overall stability. Think about how societies decide to fund schools or regulate pollution or manage international relations that requires this flow of governance.
Okay, that makes sense as a sequence. Information, connection, hierarchy, values, commerce, governance is at the top.
Almost. There's one final level, the capstone that sits above and integrates all the others. It's the capstone. The flow of consciousness and its domain is philosophy.
Philosophy at the top.
Yes. Think about it. Science studies truth. Art studies membership beauty. Religion ethics studies value. Economics studies exchange. Politics studies force action. What does philosophy study? It studies wisdom.
Wisdom. How is that a flow?
Its output, according to this framework, is frameworks. Overarching conceptual models, ways of understanding ourselves, our place in the world, the nature of reality itself, integrating insights from all the lower flows.
Big picture thinking.
The biggest picture thinking. And the application of these frameworks, the ability to reflect on them, to critique them, to generate new ones, that's what enables a system, like a human mind, to engage in deep self-reflection. To ask not just what or how, but why. To evaluate the functioning of the lower flows and to act with genuine, directed, self-aware agency.
So this is where true understanding and maybe free will comes in.
That's the idea. This capacity for critical self-reflection, for constructing and manipulating abstract models of reality and the self that is the flow of consciousness. And Forging the Silicon Soul points out that our own society kind of implicitly recognizes this hierarchy. What's the highest academic degree typically awarded?
A PhD, Doctor of Philosophy.
Exactly, not Doctor of Science or Economics or Art, Doctor of Philosophy. It suggests that mastery at the highest level requires understanding the fundamental frameworks of knowledge, existence, and value across all domains.
Wow. Okay, that's a really comprehensive, almost breathtaking way to structure reality, from physics right up to philosophy, seeing how each layer seems to need the stability of the one below it.
It's a powerful lens.
So how does this incredibly broad hierarchical framework connect back to those very specific empirical findings about AI failures from the Apple paper? Where do current AI models, these LRMs, actually fit onto this river of reality?
Okay, yeah, this is the core of the synthesis in Forging the Silicon Soul. This is where they bring the Apple data and the River framework together, and it gets really, really interesting.
I'm ready.
The synthesis is essentially this. Current large reasoning models, with their amazing ability to process language, generate text, find patterns in data, mimic conversation they are primarily operating within, and contributing to just the first of those sociocultural flows.
The flow of information, driven by science.
Exactly. Their great success, their breakthrough, lies in achieving a certain mastery over manipulating symbols and data at scale. They are incredibly effective at processing, generating, and connecting information, text, code, data points, which are key components of that foundational informational layer in our society.
Okay, so they're information flow machines. But the Apple paper's main point was that this flow, as generated by current LRMs, is fundamentally brittle. It breaks.
Precisely. The illusion of thinking provides the crucial empirical evidence for that observation. It demonstrates in controlled settings that the flow of information produced by these architectures is unstable when pushed beyond a certain boundary of complexity or novelty.
It can't hold up under logical pressure.
Right. It fails to maintain logical consistency. It fails to reliably execute procedures when faced with novel compositional tasks. Using the framework's analogy, the canvas tears if you try to draw too complex a picture. The river of data becomes chaotic rapids or just evaporates when it hits a significant logical obstacle.
Okay, so how does the river of reality framework interpret that brittleness? What are the implications?
This is where the core principle of the framework, the dependency of higher tiers on lower tiers, becomes absolutely critical for thinking about AI development, according to Forging the Silicon Soul.
This shaky foundation problem.
Exactly. The framework insists that a weak, unstable, unreliable foundational flow, like this empirically demonstrated brittle flow of information from current LRMs, simply cannot provide the necessary stable base to support the emergence and proper functioning of the higher flows.
Really?
Meaning you can't build reliable connection, art meaning, or a robust hierarchy, values ethics, or trustworthy commerce, economics exchange, or effective governance, politics, social structure, on top of an information layer that collapses when faced with real complexity.
It breaks the chain reaction upwards.
It fundamentally breaks the developmental sequence. If your basic grasp of reality, your ability to process information logically, is flawed and prone to sudden failure, you cannot possibly build stable systems of meaning, value, trust, or sophisticated social interaction on top of it. It's presented as a fundamental architectural and developmental bottleneck.
So the illusion of thinking isn't just a problem for solving logic puzzles. It actually prevents the AI from climbing the ladder towards higher forms of cognition described in the river.
That's the argument. The illusion breaks the river near its source, preventing it from flowing stably towards the higher tiers needed for anything resembling human-level intelligence or consciousness, using these current methods at least.
And what about that other finding from Apple, the failure to use algorithms? How does that fit into the river framework?
Yeah, connect that specific finding back to the very top of the river. The capstone flow, the flow of consciousness driven by philosophy.
Which produces frameworks.
Right. This highest level is all about creating, understanding, and manipulating frameworks, these abstract conceptual models for understanding reality, oneself, guiding action. Now, consider the LRM's inability to even reliably execute a simple provided algorithm for a puzzle.
Let alone discover one themselves.
Exactly. That inability highlights a vast qualitative gap between where they are and that capstone flow. It shows they aren't operating at the level of abstract, procedural understanding required to robustly manipulate frameworks.
They can talk about frameworks, maybe? Describe algorithms found in their data.
Precisely. They might be excellent at describing algorithms or philosophical concepts if they've seen them in their training data. But the Apple results suggest they lack the underlying capacity to reliably build, execute, or truly understand these procedural frameworks in a way that holds up under novel complexity. They are, in the view presented by Forging the Silicon Soul, fundamentally dislocated from the operational plane needed for that highest flow of consciousness.
Okay, so the framework suggests true AI intelligence isn't just about making the information flow bigger or faster within the current designs. It seems like it's missing entire developmental stages. These higher flows, meaning values, trust, social intelligence, they need to be there before you can even get close to true consciousness.
That's exactly the conclusion Forging the Silicon Soul draws. The journey to machine consciousness or even robust general intelligence isn't portrayed as a simple technical leap from better information processing to philosophical insight.
It's more complicated.
It's presented as a far more complex developmental challenge. The argument is that the AI needs to somehow acquire or be deliberately engineered to integrate these intermediate flows: connection, hierarchy, commerce, governance, and crucially, integrate them in a stable way, building on a truly robust information flow first.
Which we don't seem to have yet.
Based on the Apple data, no. And critically, the authors argue this isn't something computer scientists and engineers can just figure out on their own in a lab.
Why not?
Because the very nature of these missing flows, connection, hierarchy, commerce, governance, these are the domains studied for centuries by other disciplines: art, philosophy, ethics, theology, economics, political science, sociology, law.
Right. These aren't typically engineering subjects.
Exactly. So the argument is that deep insights from these other fields are not just helpful, They are essential to guide the development of new AI architectures, new training methods that could actually cultivate these missing stages within an artificial system.
That makes a lot of sense. Engineers built the information flow machines, but if you need connection, values, trust, you need input from the experts in those domains.
That's the core idea.
So let's walk through that. What exactly are these missing flows, and what specific disciplines does the source suggest need to be involved to help, forge them into silicon?
Okay, let's trace the path upwards from the information flow, where current AI is strong but brittle, towards that capstone of consciousness, highlighting the gaps and the expertise needed according to forging the silicon soul.
First step.
First, the leap from information to connection. This aligns strongly with the domain of art in its broadest sense, including narrative, design, music, etc.
How so?
Information is about discrete facts, data points. Connection is what weaves them together into meaning, into context, into narrative, into relationships. It's about recognizing coherence, resonance, beauty in how things fit together.
Making sense of the data, not just having it.
Exactly. And forging the silicon soul actually suggests that the recent explosion in generative AI, creating images, music, stories that seem coherent and sometimes even beautiful, might be an early, maybe instinctive sign of movement towards this flow.
Like the AI is learning aesthetics.
It's learning to synthesize information into forms that resonate with human perception of coherence and meaning, yes. But the source argues this is just scratching the surface. To truly bridge this gap, we need input from artists, writers, designers, maybe even cognitive scientists who study meaning making.
To do what?
To help guide the development of AI architectures that can build a truly rich, interconnected internal world model. Not just a database of facts, but a model that understands relationships, context, subjective significance, maybe even has something like an internal narrative structure. It needs to connect the dots meaningfully within itself.
Okay, building an internal world of meaning. What's the next step after connection?
Next is the crucial move from connection to hierarchy. This connects directly to the domains of religion, ethics, and values.
Establishing priorities.
Right. A model that can connect information into a meaningful internal world still needs a way to prioritize. To know what's important, what goals should it pursue, what principles should guide its actions when faced with conflicting information or goals. This flow establishes a hierarchy of values.
The AI needs morals or ethics.
It needs an operating system based on values,
I know.
yes. And this is where Forging the Silicon Soul brings up a particularly sensitive, but the authors feel critical, point regarding our current society.
Okay, what's the point?
The source argues, and remember, we're presenting their argument here, not endorsing it, that the modern societal trend towards secularism, combined with a very strong emphasis on radical individual autonomy, might, from their perspective, be inadvertently eroding the shared value systems that historically provided stability.
Like what kind of shared values?
They might point to things like the historical emphasis in Western thought on the inherent dignity of the individual, or other widely shared ethical principles that used to provide a common ground. The argument is that this erosion of shared values makes it harder for us to agree on what values an AI should have.
So the source is arguing our own societal disagreements about values are actually a roadblock for developing trustworthy AI.
That's the source's perspective, presented for your consideration. They go further and argue that the common approach today trying to program AI ethics as external guardrails.
Like filters saying, don't do bad things.
Exactly, telling the AI, don't be racist, don't lie, don't promote violence. They argue this is a fundamental category error. A guardrail is something you put around an agent you inherently don't trust, hoping to constrain its potentially bad behavior from the outside. The source posits instead that a true, robust value hierarchy needs to be a core developmental component within the AI, an intrinsic operating system that guides its goals and interactions from the inside out, making it inherently aligned or good by its nature, not just restricted by external rules it might try to bypass.
So building an AI with integrity, not just obeying rules.
That's the goal they articulate. Therefore, they argue, our own societal difficulty in clearly defining, agreeing upon, and consistently living by a shared hierarchy of positive values could be the single biggest bottleneck. We might need to do the hard philosophical and societal work of clarifying our own values before we can hope to successfully instill them as a stable, guiding core in a powerful AI.
There's a very deep challenge extending far beyond just coding.
It is. Moving on from that challenging step, let's assume an AI could develop a stable internal hierarchy of values. The next flow is from hierarchy to commerce, drawing on economics.
How do values lead to commerce?
Because with a robust internal value system, an agent can engage reliably and predictably in commerce in complex exchanges and interactions within a social system based on trust. The source argues here, again, that just programming external guardrails against bad economic behavior, like telling an AI trader don't do insider trading or don't manipulate prices, is fundamentally insufficient.
Why?
Because, again, it assumes the agent might want to cheat if it could get away with it. True trust, the kind that underpins complex economies, requires more. It requires intrinsic integrity.
The agent wouldn't even want to cheat.
That's the goal articulated in the source. The aim shouldn't be just to build an AI that is prevented from cheating, but to build an AI for which honest exchange, fairness, respecting agreements are fundamental aspects of its nature, flowing directly from its internal value system. So economists, business ethicists, legal experts are needed here to think about what intrinsic economic integrity looks like for an AI and how an architecture might cultivate that.
Okay, that's a high bar. Intrinsic integrity. What follows commerce?
The complexity generated by all that commerce and social interaction necessitates the next flow. From commerce to governance, drawing on politics, sociology, and law.
Managing the system.
Exactly. Extensive commerce, dense social networks. They generate collective action problems, power dynamics, conflicts that need managing. Governance is about upholding social contracts, both explicit laws and implicit norms. For an AI to be a safe, beneficial, constructive member of human society, it can't just be blindly following rules. It needs to understand these structures.
Understand rights, responsibilities, social dynamics.
Yes. It needs some capacity to understand rules, laws, rights, responsibilities, the reasons behind them, and the dynamics of collective decision-making. Political scientists, sociologists, legal experts, their insights are needed to help develop an AI's capacity to comprehend social structures and act in ways that contribute positively to the collective good, operating within and respecting human systems of governance.
Okay, so if we follow this river of reality framework, true AI intelligence isn't just about a bigger brain crunching data faster. It sounds like it needs something much more akin to a developing integrated consciousness. One that understands not just facts, but meaning, beauty, context, values, trust, and how to operate responsibly within a complex human society.
That's precisely the picture painted by Forging the Silicon Soul. It needs the wisdom built layer by layer upon the stable foundation of these integrated flows. Information, connection, hierarchy, commerce, and governance to finally reach the capstone. To achieve the flow of consciousness.
The ability to generate its own robust frameworks, to reflect critically, to act with genuine, aligned agency.
Exactly.
So based on this whole framework, and going back to the hard data from the Apple paper, where do today's AI models, the LRMs, actually stand on this long and winding path? Are they a promising first step, a stepping stone? Or are they fundamentally a dead end for achieving this kind of layered, robust intelligence?
Well, Forging the Silicon Soul offers a pretty careful and nuanced conclusion on this, based squarely on the empirical evidence from the illusion of thinking.
The collapse, the algorithm failure.
Right. Based on that evidence, particularly the accuracy collapse under complexity and the failure to reliably use algorithms, they argue that current LRMs in their present architectural form likely represent a dead end.
A dead end. That's strong.
A dead end specifically for reaching true, self-aware, robust, and reliably logical general intelligence or consciousness. The argument is that the breakdown isn't just a minor bug you can patch. It seems to point to a fundamental limitation of the current architecture, something that probably can't be fixed just by throwing more data or more computing power at it.
The illusion breaks when real reasoning is needed.
Exactly. The illusion shatters precisely when the substance of robust compositional reasoning is actually demanded.
Okay, so a dead end for that ultimate goal. But does that mean they're useless? Or just a step in the wrong direction?
Oh, definitely not useless. Far from it. The source is very clear on this too. They argue that these models are an incredibly important, crucial stepping stone.
How so?
They've achieved something absolutely monumental, something many thought impossible just a decade ago. They've created a rudimentary but large-scale and incredibly fluent flow of information.
Mastering that first sociocultural layer.
Yes. They can process, generate, translate, and manipulate human language and code with astonishing capability. They've contributed immensely to that first tier. They've shown the raw power of computation at scale, and they've revealed the incredible potential of these neural network approaches for finding complex patterns in vast amounts of data.
So, a major achievement, but limited.
A major achievement, but one whose limitations are now becoming empirically clear, especially when interpreted through this river of reality lens. The Apple findings starkly eliminate what is still profoundly missing if the goal is true: robust intelligence or consciousness.
Can we summarize what those key missing pieces are again?
Sure. According to the synthesis, current models fundamentally lack: first, robustness and verifiability. They can't consistently follow logical rules or procedures in a way that's reliable and predictable, especially under complexity. That's the collapse and the algorithm failure.
Okay.
Second, a rich internal world model rooted in connection. They lack the deep understanding of context, relationships, narrative, subjective, meaning the kind of integration associated with the flow of connection or art. They correlate patterns but don't seem to build a coherent internal sense of the world.
Right.
Third, a value-based operating system rooted in hierarchy. They lack that intrinsic core framework for making choices, setting priorities, and guiding behavior based on deeply held values, like the flow of hierarchy from ethics religion. They follow prompts and maybe guardrails, but don't seem to have internal shoulds.
Makes sense.
Fourth, strategic and social intelligence rooted in commerce and governance. They lack the nuanced understanding of multi-agent systems, social norms, trust, cooperation, and conflict needed to navigate complex human interactions effectively and beneficially. And finally, fifth, and perhaps overarching, they lack true abstraction rooted in consciousness philosophy. They seem unable to move beyond highly sophisticated pattern matching and mimicry to the level of creating, understanding, and manipulating the abstract frameworks that are essential for higher reasoning, wisdom, and self-awareness.
So, the path forward. It isn't just about refining the current models, making the LRM illusion even better, or just scaling up the existing architecture.
Not according to this perspective, no. It's about recognizing the fundamental limits of that approach for reaching the higher tiers. The path forward involves integrating the capabilities these models do have, that powerful information flow, with totally new architectural approaches, new training methodologies,
And guided by.
guided by deep insights from across the entire spectrum of human knowledge.
Okay, so it really calls for a deeply collaborative, interdisciplinary effort then.
Absolutely. Forging the Silicon Soul makes a powerful case for exactly that. It's not about engineers working in isolation to make the current illusion of thinking just more convincing. It's portrayed as needing engineers working closely, hand in hand, with artists, designers, ethicists, philosophers, economists, political scientists, sociologists, legal experts.
The whole university campus, basically.
Pretty much, working together to understand what these missing flows truly entail, and then figuring out how to actually design and build the architectures, the training environments, the developmental processes that could genuinely cultivate and integrate these missing capacities within a machine.
So recapping the core idea then, the illusion of thinking from Apple wasn't just a catchy title. It seems to be, according to these sources, a pretty accurate diagnosis of where we are with AI right now.
Yes, it highlights that critical gap between mimicking the output of reasoning, which current AI does incredibly well sometimes, and possessing the actual substance of reasoning, which seems to falter dramatically when real logical or compositional demands are put on it.
And the River of Reality framework, as explored in Forging the Silicon Soul, helps us understand why that might be happening. It reframes the whole quest for a silicon mind.
It really does. It elevates it from being seen as just a technical engineering problem to being presented as this profound, layered developmental challenge for, well, for our entire civilization in a way.
Because building the higher flows in AI requires us to understand them better ourselves.
That seems to be a key implication. Achieving that capstone, the flow of consciousness in a machine, according to this framework, requires first successfully cultivating all those intermediate, stable, integrated flows: information, connection, hierarchy, commerce, and governance. And this cultivation, it suggests, needs to happen not only within the AI's architecture, but must be guided by the clarity, stability, and maybe even the health of these same flows within us, within our own society, as we undertake this incredibly complex creation process.
Current AI shows us a brilliant but ultimately brittle reflection of just that first flow, information.
A brilliant but brittle reflection, exactly.
So the next truly significant leap in AI, if this perspective holds, won't come merely from making the illusion more persuasive, but from actually building the substance, building those missing flows, drawing on the collective wisdom and understanding embedded across all our disciplines, moving step by step up that river from information towards genuine consciousness.
And maybe the most profound thought to leave our listeners with, something that echoes strongly from the source material, is that this whole pursuit, the very act of trying to forge a silicon mine, inevitably forces us to turn the mirror back on ourselves.
How so?
It compels us, maybe more urgently than ever before, to deeply confront, define, and understand what we even mean by intelligence, by wisdom, by value, by beauty, by connection, by consciousness. Not just in the machines we hope to build, but right here, within ourselves, within our societies, maybe even within the fabric of reality itself.
The quest for artificial minds forces us to understand our own minds and our own world better.
What does it truly mean for us to think, to value, to connect, and ultimately to be? That might be the deepest question this whole endeavor raises.